Good afternoon. It's good to see you all, and Ambassador Dusset, thank you for that kind introduction. And it's great to be here, and it's great to be here at this event co-hosted by the GSP and the Graduate Institute. And I would like to start by saying and telling you that I'm really delighted by being here in Geneva, because I feel very much at home in Geneva, because in my previous life as a Norwegian politician, I used to spend a lot of time here, especially in the years between 2001 and 2005, when I was in the board of something called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, GAVI. And that was a big event, or not event, but a big organization, which was very much funded by the Gates Foundation and by the government of Norway and some other governments. And the aim was to immunize children all over the world. At that time, I was not so very much focused on increased defense spending. Then my focus was more on increased spending on health. Now I'm focused on both health and defense spending. So I have good memories from that time in Geneva. In addition, I have to tell you that I also have a relationship to Geneva because my parents, they used to work here when my father was High Commissioner for Refugees and my mother worked in the International Red Cross Committee back in 1990. At that time I had two small children, so we very often went to Geneva and we traveled around here, and I have seen the beauty of this very beautiful city. So that's one reason why I'm glad to be back. The other reason why I'm glad to be back is that Geneva is really a platform for peace. The institutes, the Graduate Institute and the Geneva Center for Security Policy are just two examples of how this city is so important for dialogue, for diplomacy, for education. And only the fact that we have this house, Maison de la Paix, is a great expression of the importance of Geneva contributing to a more peaceful world, trying to build international cooperation, trying to build international institutions, and trying to create a more peaceful world. As you know, NATO is not based in Geneva. NATO is based in Brussels. But our aim, our task is the same as the task of all the institutions, all organizations based here in Geneva working for peace, because the core task of NATO is to preserve the peace. So we are working in different ways, but the goal is the same. And that is to create a rules-based order, stronger international cooperation, resolving conflicts through negotiations, political dialogue instead of armed conflicts, to make sure that we preserve the peace and prevent conflicts. NATO has existed for almost 70 years. I think it was Secretary Mattis, the new defense secretary in the United States. He stated in the hearings in the US Congress before he was confirmed that NATO is the most successful alliance in history. And of course, I totally agree with him. He's a very wise man. But the reason why NATO is the most successful alliance in history is that NATO has been able to change, to adapt when the world is changing. And just briefly remind you of how that has happened. Because for 40 years, since NATO was founded in 1949, until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, NATO had one, and actually only one task, and that was to deter the Soviet Union. So the only thing we did was to be present in Europe with strong forces, armed forces, with troops, with American troops, massed along the border, East-West Germany, and also in other parts of Europe, to deter the Soviet Union from attacking West Europe. And that was quite successful. And the Cold War ended without NATO firing a single shot. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. The Soviet Union was dissolved. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved. And people started to ask whether we need NATO anymore. And I remember someone formulated the sentence, NATO either has to go out of business or out of area. And what we did was actually to go out of area. So we adapted, we responded to a new world. We reduced our military presence in Europe significantly. The United States withdrew most of its forces, or at least significant parts of its forces from Europe. Defense spending went down, and what NATO did was then to be less focused on Europe, much more focused outside NATO territory. It started in the Balkans. We helped to end two wars, bloody wars, first in Bosnia, with 60,000 troops, NATO troops on the ground, with airstrikes. Then later on in Serbia and Kosovo, helping to end the bloodshed there. Then we went even further to Afghanistan, fighting terrorism, and we fought piracy off the Horn of Africa. So our focus was out of area, outside at least our part of Europe, out of NATO territory. So we adapted. Then in 2014, we were forced to adapt again. Because in 2014, the world changed again. And I think sometimes we are underestimating, because it is so close, the magnitude of the change we are witnessing. In one way, I think that 2014 will be as pivotal a year as 1949, as 1989, and then 2014 will also be a very important year in the history of our part of the world. For two reasons. One is the emergence of, that was the year we really discovered the threat coming from ISIL. And I have told many people that when I was first asked whether I was willing to consider to be the Secretary General of NATO in January 2014, hardly anyone had heard about ISIL or Daesh. That was one among many terrorist organizations, but it was not more important than all the others. Then a few months later, Daesh controlled big parts of Syria, big parts of Iraq, Mosul, and Raqqa. So that, and of course, we have been confronted with terrorist organizations before, but Daesh, ISIL is different. Because of its brutality, because of its strength. They're not only a normal terrorist organization, but they have been able to control big parts of two countries, Iraq and Syria. And because of the proximity, how close it is to NATO, bordering a NATO ally, Turkey, and also the presence in Northern Africa. So all of this makes Daesh, ISIL, a fundamentally new threat and challenge for NATO. Then the same year, we also saw a much more aggressive Russia. It has developed over some time, but in 2014, we saw the illegal annexation of Crimea. And that is the first time since the end of the Second World War that borders have been changed in Europe by the use of force, one land, one country, annexing a part of another country. So it's not only serious because it affects people in Ukraine, but it's also serious because it violates a fundamental principle which the security and the peace in Europe has been based on for decades. And they also started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So the illegal annexation of Crimea, the destabilization of eastern Ukraine added to, in a way, the new security environment which required a response from NATO. And I think then NATO once again proved that we are able to adapt, that we are vigilant and willing to change when required. And I will just briefly tell you how we are adapting. I will not mention, as I will not be able to address all the issues that NATO are addressing, but just briefly mention some core elements on how we are adapting, and then I will be ready to answer your questions. NATO is adapting partly by strengthening our collective defense in Europe, and partly by stepping up our efforts to project stability to our neighborhood, fighting terrorism and stabilizing our neighborhood. First, some words about how we are adapting by strengthening our collective defense in Europe. We are increasing the readiness of our forces. We have tripled the size of something we call the NATO response force, which are forces that are able to move on very short notice. We have established 8 new headquarters in the eastern part of the alliance. And we are now deploying 3 battle groups and 4 battalions, multinational battle groups, to the 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and to Poland. And the reason why we do this is to make sure that no potential adversary can make any miscalculations about the readiness and the resolve of NATO to defend all allies against any threat. That is deterrence, deliver credible deterrence. And let me underline that the reason why we are so focused on credible deterrence in NATO is that that's the core task of the alliance. Because the whole alliance is based on the idea that an attack on one ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance. An attack on one ally will be regarded as an attack on 28. And as long as that resolve is credible, as long as that unity is strong, then we prevent anyone from attacking us. So the reason why we want NATO to continue to be strong and continue to be able to deliver credible deterrence in a new security environment is not to provoke a conflict, but it is to prevent the conflict, to preserve the peace. And therefore we have increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. At the same time, we are very much aware of the fact that we have to find a balance. Because we don't want a new Cold War, we don't want a new arms race, we don't want confrontation with Russia, we don't want to isolate Russia. Actually, we regard Russia as our neighbor. Russia is there to stay, and we are striving for a more constructive and cooperative relationship with Russia. Therefore, it has been very important for NATO to convey the message that we would keep channels for political dialogue open, to address difficult issues like, for instance, Ukraine, but also how we can have more transparency, predictability, because with more forces, more exercises, more presence of military troops along our borders, the risk for incidents, accidents have increased, and if we have to try to do whatever we can to prevent them from happening, and if they happen, make sure that they don't spiral out of control and really create a dangerous situation. We saw the downing of the Russian plane over Turkey. We have seen some busing and some unsafe behavior of Russian planes close to NATO ships in the Black Sea, US ships in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and we have to do whatever we can to prevent that kind of incidents really creating dangerous situations. So we are addressing predictability, transparency in our military relations with Russia. The message is defense and dialogue, not defense or dialogue. And I have stated many times that my experience as a Norwegian politician is that there is no contradiction between defense, deterrence, and dialogue. Actually, as long as we are firm, as long as we are predictable, as long as we are united, then we are also able to engage in political dialogue with Russia and strive for a more cooperative relationship with Russia. So that's how we are adapting to the challenges posed by a more assertive Russia in the East. Then we are also adapting to the increased turmoil, violence we see in the South. That's about projecting stability. And it's about projecting stability. It's about stabilizing our neighborhood based on the idea that when our neighbors are stable, we are more secure. And we have been doing that for many years, but we have to do more. We have been in Afghanistan for many years. All NATO allies contribute to and participate in the global coalition fighting Daesh or ISIL. NATO also provides direct support to the coalition with our AWACS surveillance planes, and we have started to train Iraqi officers. And we're also present in Turkey with Patriot batteries and other assurance measures for Turkey being so close to the turmoil and the violence in Syria and Iraq. And we are also stepping up our work with and cooperation with other partners in the region, in Tunisia, Jordan, and so on. And the message is that we have learned some lessons from our presence in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, but also for some NATO allies that have been present in Iraq, that of course NATO has to be able to deploy large number of combat troops in big combat operations also in the future, as we have done, for instance, in Afghanistan or in Bosnia. But in the long run, prevention is much better than intervention. So if you're able to prevent conflicts, that's much better than if you're forced to deploy forces to solve a conflict. And the other lesson we have learned is that we have to train local forces. We have to build local capacity. We have to build local defense institutions. Because in the long run, it's much better that local forces, local institutions fight terrorism, stabilize their own country instead of we doing it for them. And that's one of the lessons we learned, for instance, in Bosnia. We have been quite successful in Bosnia 20 years ago, 2 decades ago. There were 3 armies, a Bosniak army, a Croat army, and a Serb army, fighting each other. Now there is one multi-ethnic army in Bosnia. I'm not saying that everything is fine in Bosnia, but I'm saying at least they have one army which is able to work together in Bosnia. I think if we made any mistakes in Afghanistan, one lesson learned there is that we should have started much earlier to train local Afghan forces, to enable them to protect their own country. So the idea of NATO projecting stability is very much about how can we build local capacity in different ways in different countries, not only by training local forces, but also by fighting corruption, building institutions. And that's exactly what we do together with institutions here in Geneva, with DCAF, but also with GCSP, and also with the Swiss government. We are working on how to build local capacity, train local forces, build local institutions. So that's the best weapon we have against terrorism, is to train local forces to enable them to fight terrorism. The last thing, then, so NATO is adapting collective defense in Europe, projecting stability to our neighborhood in different ways, but and together with partners like Switzerland, but also like institutions we find here in Geneva. The last thing I will say before I answer questions is that, of course, the only way that NATO can remain strong, the only way that NATO can deliver credible deterrence and project stability, is that we stay united as a transatlantic alliance. What makes NATO unique is that it binds together Europe and North America, United States and Canada. And after the US elections, the elections in the United States, there has been some questions whether the United States is still committed to the transatlantic bond, to NATO. And I can tell you that I'm absolutely certain that the United States is and will remain committed to the transatlantic bond and to NATO. And I can tell you that partly because that's what President Trump has told me. In 2 phone calls, he has strongly conveyed the message that the United States remains committed to NATO, unwavering support to the transatlantic bond. And that is a very consistent message from the President, from the Vice President, who visited NATO a couple of weeks ago, from Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, from Secretary Tillerson, Secretary of State, and from the whole security team. But it's not only something they convey in words, but it's something also they deliver in deeds. Because we see more US presence in Europe now for the first time in many years. A new armored brigade, more pre-positioned equipment. So this is not only something they say, but it's also something they do with more presence in Europe. And let me also add that the United States know that strong NATO, strong transatlantic bond is not only good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States. 2 world wars and the Cold War have taught us all that stability in Europe is good for Europe, of course, but it's also good for the United States. So I am absolutely confident that the United States remains committed to the North Atlantic Alliance. That's good for Europe, it's good for North America, but most importantly, it's good for peace and stability in our world. Because the core task of the alliance is to preserve the peace and to make sure that we can continue to live safely in a peaceful part of the world. So thank you so much, and then I'm ready to answer questions.